There's a conspiracy here, and I will seek it out!
Hey, what's up, world? So, last month, actually, I think it was like in April. Right now, it's May 30th, it's Memorial Day when I'm recording this. But I believe sometime in April, people had responded to Russia's supposed denazification program in the Ukraine by saying, oh, well, how can you say that there's Nazis in Ukraine when Zelensky is Jewish? Right? That's what people said to Russia. And this Russian diplomat, Sergei Lavrov, he responded by saying, well, you know, Hitler was part Jewish. That didn't stop him from leading the Nazi party. Now, when Sergei Lavrov had said this, when he had made this claim, it's not really a claim, it's, as I'm going to show, it's backed by a lot of evidence. So when he made this claim, Israel became outraged. Israel was like, oh no, how dare you say Hitler was part Jewish? I don't know why, actually, well, I know exactly why this would upset Israel. But let's not get into that. Before I get into any more information, I just want to say one thing. The information that I'm going to be covering in this video, at least most of the information I'm going to be covering in this video, actually, it's not really the information I'm going to be covering in this video. The topic of this video, that is that Hitler was Jewish, and we'll also be talking about the world wars in this video, was supposed to be part 8 of my Uncensored History of the Club documentary. So for those of you who are aware, I have this documentary, I have 5 parts of it, and I have not done a part in like 2 years. I think I did the 5th part, as you see here, February 6th of 2020. So I just wanted to let those who are a fan of this documentary of mine know that this video is basically going to be part 8 of this documentary. Alrighty. So with that out of the way, let's start getting into the information. So, when you do the research into Hitler and this whole theory that he has Jewish roots in his family, or that he comes from a Jewish tree, many people claim that it was his grandfather on his father's side of the family that was Jewish. Hitler's grandmother on his father's side had a child out of wedlock. Now, when you look up who was Hitler's grandfather, you get this. You get these 3 characters. Now, these 2 characters are the people who are like debated about on his father's side in mainstream history. So like mainstream historians claim that it's one of these 2 douchebags. This is his father's side, and I believe this is his mother's side. Now, what's interesting though is, as you're going to see, his mother was actually like the second cousin of his father, if his father's father was really one of these 2 guys. So to be perfectly clear, to be crystal clear here, if this guy Johann Georg Hitler is Hitler's father, then Hitler's mother was the second cousin to Hitler's father. Now, if this guy was Hitler's grandfather, as you will see will be speculated, then Hitler's mother is Hitler's father's niece. Now, I also want to point something out. Google has this wrong. You see, Google has it as if the dispute is on Hitler's mother's side of the family, because it has these 2 guys via Clara Hitler. You see, Johann Baptist Polzy, which is actually Hitler's mother's father. This is Hitler's grandfather on his mother's side. But it also, for some reason, has Johann Nepomuk Hitler also via Clara Hitler. This is incorrect. As you will be seeing, the dispute here, this guy via Clara Hitler, it should say via Alois Hitler, because the dispute is on Alois Hitler's side. Alois Hitler, as you will see, is Hitler's father. Now, another thing that I just want to quickly point out is the Washington Post article here. I just realized right now that they refer to this claim that Hitler's a Jew, or that Hitler had Jewish blood. For some reason, they refer to it here as a zombie claim. I've never heard somebody refer to a claim as being a zombie claim. You know, they could say the false claim, the erroneous claim, you know, other kinds of claims. I've never seen a zombie claim. I've never seen that sort of wording. I mean, maybe it has to do with zombies becoming more popular in our culture. I don't really know. Now, the other funny thing is Washington Post here is wrong because they put no evidence. They say, claim, I believe that Hitler also had Jewish blood. I don't even know if this is correctly quoting Sergei Lavrov, but that's not important. But the funny thing is here it says no evidence. Now, you will also see that there is plenty of evidence to prove this. Now, with that out of the way, oh yeah, by the way, I just wanted to show this to you guys to show you what Google comes up with. You know, you type into Google, and then you get this, and then you're like, oh, look, they know who Hitler's grandfather is. There's no conspiracy. But Google is wrong. This is misinformation, and I'm going to be proving that in this video. So let's start off with this book that has been archived by the New York Times. So this website is archive.newyorktimes.com, and it's this book by Ian Kershaw. It's actually this specific book. Let this page load. It's titled Hitler, Fantasy and Failure, Summary and Analysis. I guess it's more of like an essay, and it's really short. It's about 2 pages at approximately 400 words per page. So it's actually a really quick read, and the entire thing has been archived, so you can read it for free at this archive.newyorktimes.com. Let's look into some of the information that they present here. Okay, so the first of many strokes of good fortune for Adolf Hitler took place 13 years before he was born. In 1876, actually, you gotta love that number 13 here, okay? In 1876, the man who was to become his father changed his name from Alois Schicklgruber to Alois Hitler. Adolf can be believed when he said that nothing his father had done had pleased him so much as to drop the coarsely rustic name of Schicklgruber. Certainly, Hail Schicklgruber would have sounded an unlikely salutation to a national hero. I really hope I'm pronouncing that. Schicklgruber. That sounds correct, right? So the Schicklgrubers had for generations been a peasant family, small holders in the Waldviertel, a picturesque but poor, hilly, and, as the name suggests, woody area in the most northwesterly part of Lower Austria. By the way, Lower Austria is not like the lower part of Austria. Lower Austria is actually like a state within Austria, and believe it or not, Lower Austria is actually in the upper northeastern part of Austria. I'll be presenting that information later on. It's very important for figuring out who Hitler's father really was. Bordering on Bohemia, whose inhabitants had something of a reputation for being dour, hard-nosed, and unwelcoming. Hitler's father, Alois, had been born there on 7th June 1837 in the village of Strones, as the illegitimate child of Maria Anna Schicklgruber, then 42 years old and daughter of a poor smallholder, Johann Schicklgruber, and baptized as Alois Schicklgruber in nearby Dollersheim the same day. The baptismal register left a blank in the space allocated to the baby's father. The name of Hitler's paternal grandfather was not disclosed and, despite much speculation, remains unknown ever since. 5 years later, Maria Anna married Johann George Heidler, a 50-year-old miller's journeyman from Speitel, some 15 miles away. Heidler's aimless and meandering lifestyle had brought him to Strones, where he had for some time dwelt in the same house as Maria Anna and her father. Okay, so I mean, there's just some things I want to stop and deviate and just point out to. I just got to digress and point this out. So this is a place where the inhabitants had a reputation for being dour, hard-nosed, and unwelcoming, but somehow they welcome this guy into their house to actually stay with them, who's just some guy who has an aimless and meandering lifestyle. Okay, whatever. I'll buy all of that, okay? Let's not create conspiracies on top of the conspiracies. Let's just stick with as much of the mainstream history as possible, okay? So this guy dealt for some time in the same house as this guy, Maria Anna, and her father. And this is 5 years actually after she had Alois, after she had Hitler's father. 5 years after, this guy staying there in their house, and they decide to get married, okay? They decide to get married 5 years after she has the son. The marriage lasted for 5 years, which is also pretty interesting. Maria Anna died in 1847, and Hitler's hand-to-mouth existence was ended by a stroke a decade later. So when Alois's mother passed away, he was probably like 10 years old? Whatever. Not important. So, no later than the time of his mother's death, and perhaps earlier, which is very interesting, the youngster Alois was taken by Johann George's brother, Johann Nepomuk Hitler. So, Nepomuk Hitler, 15 years his junior, to live on Nepomuk's middle-sized farm in Spittal. The reasons for Nepomuk's effective adoption of young Alois are unclear, but to all appearances the boy was provided with a modest but good home. After going to elementary school, Alois took up an apprenticeship with a local cobbler, and already at the age of 13, like many country lads, made his way to Vienna to continue his training in leather work. I just want to say this, being taken under like another person's wing, not having a father in his life, this is almost identical to Alexander Hamilton's life. And I made a video about Alexander the Conman Hamilton. If you haven't seen this video that I made about Alexander Hamilton, proving how Hamilton was put in the position that he was put in by members of the club, I suggest you watch that. Okay, so unclear. Anyway, yeah, he went to Vienna to continue his training in leatherwork. Him going to Vienna is also very important, as you will see. Okay. So, then the next paragraph, it just basically talks about how Hitler was the first social climber in his family, and how he actually made it to become the customs inspector in this one inn, or in this one place, okay? And it's like, he pretty much got like Hitler's father got to the highest possible position, or got the highest obtainable job for somebody with his education. Okay, a year later, this is a year after he obtains this like top position, this inspector's position, this customs inspector position in 1875. A year later came the change of name. This had nothing to do with any social stigma attached to Alois's illegitimacy. Though castigated by the Catholic Church, illegitimacy was scarcely an unusual feature of Austrian country life. Alois did not attempt to conceal his illegitimacy, this is very important, even after 1876. It is unclear whether the impulse for the change of name came from Alois himself or from his uncle and effective stepfather. It's his step-uncle, because it's the brother of the guy that wasn't even his father, but for some reason they refer to him as his uncle here. An effective stepfather, Nepomuk, who, deprived of male heirs, seems to have made a legacy to Alois dependent upon the adoption of his own name. The legalization protocol of a notary in Witra on 6 June 1876, signed by 3 witnesses, that special number 3, recorded Alois as the son of George Hitler. Interesting. The name is already entered here in this form, not as Heidler. Then the following day, the legitimation of Alois, 39 years after he had been born, was completed when the parish priest of Dalarhusium altered the birth register to strike out the name Schickelgruber, replacing, quote, out of wedlock by within wedlock, and entering in the hitherto empty box for the father's name, George Hitler. This was the Johann George Hitler who had married Alois's mother in 1842, who had been dead for 19 years, but had, according to the 3 witnesses of the legitimizing ceremony, all of who had family connections, and according to Alois himself, that means that like this is according to the 3 witnesses and according to Alois himself, so according to 4 people, acknowledged his paternity. So these 4 people, all of a sudden, this far down the line, after he had obtained this inspection, this customs inspector position, all of a sudden, all 4 of these people all now acknowledge that this other guy, George Hitler, was actually the father, was actually his father. Okay, so that's according to all of them. The priest's entry notes also the testimony of the witnesses that Alois's father had requested the entry of his name in the baptismal register. So not only did they change the birth register, they also changed the baptismal register. So all of these people, all of a sudden, this late into this guy's life, at this point in time, just 13 years before Hitler was to be born, all of a sudden they're all like, oh yeah, this guy was the father, and not only was he the father, but he also wanted his name to be entered into the baptismal register. Okay. The change of name, an event at the time of significance only for the history of a peasant family in provincial Austria, has attracted unceasing speculation purely because it is inextricably bound up with the identity of the grandfather of Adolf Hitler. Only 3 possibilities need consideration. This is according to this guy. And of these, the first 2 amount to little more than whether there was an undisclosed minor scandal within the Hitler family, while the 3rd possibility, which would historically have been of some importance, can, in the light of the evidence, be discounted. So this article is already setting up the idea that the 3rd possibility, which is that Hitler was Jewish, and that he, along with whoever his real grandfather was trying to hide that connection, was trying to hide that family connection. Clearly there's a massive conspiracy going on here, but this author here claims that, it's just, it's actually just a minor scandal being covered up amongst this family. They tried covering up this scandal, but then later on, when this one guy had no female offspring, or had no male heirs, they decided to, we'll legitimize it and we'll make Hitler Alois Hitler, the sole male heir of pretty much that entire family. Actually, this is a post-recording editing. I just realized they didn't make this guy Alois Hitler the sole inheritor of this family. At least they didn't do so, overtly. Because what the author says later on is that they told the inheritors, the people who were supposed to inherit this guy's property, this guy Nepomuk, they told his inheritors that there was nothing to inherit, and then a couple months later, Alois Hitler ends up buying a house that's several thousands of whatever their currency was at the time. And really, this should raise a lot of questions about the financial situation of Alois Hitler and Adolf Hitler. Because this guy would have inherited quite a bit. And as we've already seen, he had quite a good job. He actually has the best job for somebody with his education. So he has the best job possible for somebody with his education. And then he's also the sole inheritor of this guy's property, which means that he would have probably inherited quite a bit of land, because they were all small landholders. But we'll get into that in a bit. So let's get right into the possibilities. So the first possibility is that the father of Alois was indeed the person named in the amended baptismal register and officially accepted in the Third Reich as Hitler's grandfather, Johann Georg Hitler. But if he was indeed the father, why did Hitler make no attempt during his lifetime, even at the time of his marriage, to legitimize the birth of his son? Very good question. Poverty is unlikely to have been the reason. Though it was rumored that after their marriage, Johann Georg and Maria Anna were so poor that they had to sleep in a cattle trough for a bed, it has been established that Maria Anna was less impoverished than once thought. So that's great. At the beginning they were like, oh yeah, she was in poverty for generations, but then over here, they're informing us that she was actually less impoverished than once thought. And if this was the case, then the normal reason given for the adoption by Nepomuk, this is the brother of George, an act of humanity rescuing Alois from the dire poverty in which his parents lived, disappears. And this is a good point. If these people weren't so poor, then this guy adopting him, it doesn't make sense. It's like, wait a second, why did you adopt him? He still had his supposed father in the picture for 10 years after his mother died. But remember, this guy, Nepomuk, there's evidence that he might have even adopted Alois before his mother's death. Very similar to Alexander Hamilton. And it's actually funny. Wow, I just realized it right now. Alexander Hamilton is an AH name. Adolf Hitler is another AH name. Why then was Maria Anna, who clearly did not disclose the father's name at the baptism, prepared to be separated from her only son? I don't know. I don't understand this sentence. I don't understand how she was prepared to be separated from her only son. Like, did they take the children away from the mothers if they didn't have a father? I don't know. Why was Alois not brought up by his apparent father, but instead in the home of his father's brother? And why was the legitimation, accompanied by some minor irregularities, possibly amounting to a little charade by Alois, Nepomuk, and the three witnesses, all closely connected with or related to Nepomuk, to deceive the notary and parish priest, delayed until 1876? Yes, these are all good questions. Why was it delayed until 1876? I mean, shit, why did they have to do this whole charade? And why did the witnesses, all of that is just obviously a conspiracy. That a legacy from Nepomuk to Alois was involved seems likely. But why would this have necessitated the change of name? That Nepomuk, with only female offspring, was preoccupied with the continuation of the family name through Alois, who at the time had a 50-year-old wife, seems unlikely, or at least an insufficient motive. I think you all get the point. Okay, it doesn't make any sense for this guy to have been Hitler's father and for this whole name-changing ceremony to have commenced. The answer to these questions are lost in the midst of time, and would in any case scarcely be of historical importance. This really bothers me that the author of this book makes it as if, this is not really important. This would have no historical importance, knowing who Hitler's grandfather was. But as you're going to see, it actually has a massive amount of historical importance. And that's exactly why they have gone to such an extent to hide the facts. But if there are question marks over Johann George's paternity, who else might the father have been? The other obvious candidate is Nepomuk himself. He adopted, cared for, and brought up Alois. And he was perhaps the moving spirit beyond the name change, 3 years after his wife Eva Maria had died. The name change seems to have been connected with making Alois a legatee of his will. At Nepomuk's death in 1888, his expectant heirs were told, to their surprise, that there was nothing to inherit. So this guy, after making this whole fucking name change, he told his expectant heirs, were told that there was nothing to inherit, nothing whatsoever. But only 6 months later, Alois Hitler, up to then without any notable amounts of money to play with, purchased a substantial house and adjoining property not far from Speitel, costing between 4,000 and 5,000 gulden. It seems conceivable, then, that Nepomuk, not Johann George, was the actual father of Alois, that Johann George had rejected Alois, the son of his brother, at the time of his marriage to Mary Anna, but that the family scandal had been kept quiet, and that a change of name had not been possible as long as Nepomuk's wife had lived. This is a really poorly conceived theory on the part of this author. It makes no sense. Only a really stupid and gullible reader would believe this theory. Because the author here is claiming that Alois waited so long to change his name from Schnickelgruber to Heidler because Nepomuk's wife was alive. Okay, this makes no sense, because why would Nepomuk have to wait for his wife to die to then make the claim that Alois is the son of Nepomuk's brother? He could have easily have said, hey, look, Alois is the son of my brother, and we're going to have his name changed, and we're going to correct the record. He could have done that while his wife was alive. There's zero reason for him to need to wait for his wife to die. Now, this would make sense if after his wife died, and when they changed the record, if they changed the record to claim that Alois was Nepomuk's son, then it would make sense. But in this regard, it makes zero sense. However, there is no proof, and even after his wife's death, Nepomuk, if he was himself the actual father, was keen to avoid public admission of the fact. Even after this chick died, because now over here they were claiming that it was her that was stopping the name change, but even after she died, this guy was still saying, no, I'm not the father. Some significance, and what's also funny is like, okay, wait a second, why not after she died, you're changing the name? Okay, well, if you're changing the name, why not admit then that he's your son? Why say, oh, he's actually the son of my brother? Anyway, whatever, all irrelevant. Some significance, and I'll be proving why all of this is irrelevant with Hitler's DNA, which we'll be looking at in a bit. So some significance has been read into Adolf Hitler's comments at the beginning of Mein Kampf that his father had been the son of a poor, small cottager, which was not the description of Johann George, a miller's journeyman. But Hitler was frequently inaccurate or careless with details in the autobiographical parts of Mein Kampf, and it would be a mistake to read too much into his brief and vague reference to his grandfather. So this is really interesting that Hitler was actually inaccurate and careless with the details of his own biography or his autobiography. His autobiography or the autobiographical parts of Mein Kampf, Hitler was actually inaccurate or careless with that. So this is all very interesting. The next part of this paragraph, it tries to tie this name, it tries to say like Hitler, his name, it tries to explain more, and it tries to create more of a connection between Hitler and the guy Nepomuk. It tries to say, oh yeah, that Hitler is more of a reflection of Nepomuk's Hitler or Heidler, because Nepomuk, his married name was Hitler. But then it basically says that the name Hitler could have actually just been the product of the person who was writing it, like the person at the office, like the secretary at whatever office that was writing the name in. They could have told the person the name without writing it down, and then the person could have just wrote it down like that. Okay, all irrelevant, mostly, okay? So the third possibility is that Adolf Hitler's grandfather was Jewish. Rumors to that effect circulated in Munich cafes in the early 1920s and were fostered by sensationalist journalism of the foreign press during the 1930s. It was suggested that the name Hitler was Jewish, revealed that he could be traced to a Jewish family called Hitler in Bucharest, and even claimed that his father had been sired by Baron Rothschild, in whose house in Vienna his grandmother had allegedly spent some time as a servant. But the most serious speculation about Hitler's supposed Jewish background has occurred since the Second World War and is directly traceable to the memoirs of the leading Nazi lawyer and Governor General of Poland, Hans Frank, dictated in his Nuremberg cell while awaiting the hangman. Okay, so Frank claimed that he had been called in by Hitler towards the end of 1930 and shown a letter from his nephew William Patrick Hitler, the son of his half-brother Alois, who had been briefly married to an Irish woman, threatening, in connection with the press stories circulating about Hitler's background, to expose the fact that Hitler had Jewish blood flowing in his veins. Allegedly commissioned by Hitler to look into his family history, Frank had reportedly discovered that Maria Anna Schickergruber had given birth to her child while serving as a cook in the home of a Jewish family called Frankenberger in Graz. Not only that, Frankenberger Sr. had reportedly paid regularly installments to support the child on behalf of his son around 19 years old at the birth until the child's 14th birthday. Letters were allegedly exchanged for years between Maria Anna Schicklgruber and the Frankenbergers. According to Frank, Hitler declared that he knew from what his father and grandmother had said that his grandfather was not the Jew from Graz, but because his grandmother and her subsequent husband were so poor, they had conned the Jew into believing he was the father and into paying for the boy's support. Okay, now, this is absolutely absurd. Like, to the umpteenth degree of absurdity, and I will be proving it to be absurd in a moment. Let's first finish reading what this book has to say. So Frank's story gained wide circulation in the 1950s, but it simply does not stand up. There was no Jewish family called Frankenberger in Graz during the 1830s. In fact, there was no Jews at all in the whole of Styria at the time, since Jews were not permitted in that part of Austria until the 1860s. A family named Frankenreiter did live there, but was not Jewish. There is no evidence that Maria Anna was ever in Graz, let alone was employed by the butcher Leopold Frankenreiter. No correspondence between Maria Anna and a family called Frankenberg or Frankenreiter has ever turned up. The son of Leopold Frankenreiter and alleged father of the baby, according to Frank's story and accepting that he had merely confused names, for whom Frankenreiter was seemingly prepared to pay child support for 13 years, was 10 years old at the time of Alois's birth. The Frankenreiter family had, moreover, hit upon such hard times that payment of any support to Maria Anna Schicklgruber would have been inconceivable. Equally lacking in credibility is Frank's comment that Hitler had learnt from his grandmother that there was no truth in the Graz story. His grandmother had been dead for over 40 years at the time of Hitler's birth. And whether in fact Hitler received a blackmail letter from his nephew in 1930 is also doubtful. If such was the case, then Patrick, who repeatedly made a nuisance of himself by scourging from his famous uncle, was lucky to survive the next few years, which he had spent for the most part in Germany, and to be able to leave the country for good in December 1938. His revelations, when they came in a Paris journal in August 1939, contained nothing about the Graz story. Nor did a number of different Gestapo inquiries into Hitler's family background in the 1930s and 1940s contain any reference to the alleged Graz background. Indeed, they discovered no new skeletons in the cupboard. Hans Frank's memoirs, dictated at a time when he was waiting for the hangman and plainly undergoing a psychological crisis, are full of inaccuracies and have to be used with caution. Okay, so there's a couple of things that I want to say about this. The first thing that I want to say is that this book claims that this is the most serious speculation about Hitler's supposed Jewish background. However, as we're going to see later on in this video, this isn't the most serious speculation into Hitler's Jewish background. So they're also claiming that I think they're claiming that this is like the most authentic of these claims because of the guy that it came from. They're claiming that it came from this guy, Hans Frank, who was like one of Hitler's right-hand men, and they're claiming that it came from him while he was awaiting his execution. So since it's filled with so many inaccuracies and things that doesn't even make any sense, how do we not know that this story wasn't made up to intentionally muddy the waters? Like, how do we know that it even came from this guy, Hans Frank? This story is actually going to be claimed by other people before this time. So this is how I see it. I see it exactly as that. I see that you have this story going around, and they created a bunch of false versions of it to basically discredit it. with regard to the story of Hitler's alleged Jewish grandfather, they are valueless. Hitler's grandfather, whoever he was not a Jew from Graz. I totally agree with that. The only serious contenders for the paternity of Hitler's father remain, therefore, Johann Georg Hitler and Johann Nepomuk Hitler, or Hitler. The official version always declared Johann Georg to be Adolf's grandfather. The evidence is insufficient to know, and perhaps Adolf did not know, though there is no firm reason to believe that he doubted that it was Johann Georg Hitler. Okay, well, if he didn't doubt this, then why was he so inaccurate about himself in Mein Kampf? And not only that, if Hitler had no doubt that this guy was his grandfather, why were the Gestapo making inquiries into Hitler's family in the 1930s and 40s? Seems a little odd. I mean, the official version, everyone's backing the official version, but yet the official version doesn't appear in Mein Kampf. Actually, there's inaccuracy when Hitler talks about himself in Mein Kampf. And then Hitler has the German secret police even looking into his family background on multiple occasions in the 1930s and the 1940s. Very odd. And actually, not just that, but they were talking about it as far back as the 1920s. So it seems odd that they would claim that Hitler didn't doubt this himself. In any case, in regards to Adolf, the only significance is that, were Nepomuk his grandfather, the family descent would have been even more incestuous than if his grandfather had been Johann Georg, for Nepomuk was also the grandfather of Adolf's mother. Alright, even though I know that, this video is pretty long already, I feel it's important to continue to read a little bit more of this book, because the amount of detail that they put into certain things or into certain people is really important. Like, they put a lot of details into certain people, but then when it comes to other points that they choose to neglect or to view as untrue, those things they provide very little to no details. And so I'm just gonna read a little bit, and then I'll get to that point where I criticize the details later. So let me just continue to read a little bit about Hitler's mother. So Clara Posel, I think that's how you pronounce her name, who was to become Adolf Hitler's mother, was the eldest of only 3 surviving children out of 11, the other 2 were Johanna and Theresia, from the marriage of Nepomuk's eldest daughter, Johanna Hitler, with Johann Baptist Posel, also a smallholder in Spital. Clara herself grew up on the adjacent farm to that of her grandfather, Nepomuk. So she grew up right across the street from this guy Nepomuk, or at least the adjacent farm. Clara's mother, Johanna, and her aunt, Walburga, had in fact been brought up with Alois Schicklberger in Nepomuk's house. So Alois actually was brought up with this girl. Officially, after the change of name and legitimation in 1876, Alois Hitler and Clara Posel were second cousins. So, this could be one aspect of the conspiracy. This could be one reason why Hitler tried to cover up his past. So, in 1876, aged 16, Clara Posel left the family farm in Spital and moved to this place to join the household of Alois Hitler as a maid. By this time, Alois was a well-respected customs official in Braunau. Maybe I'm pronouncing that incorrectly. His personal affairs were, however, less well-regulated than his career. He would eventually marry 3 times, first to a woman much older than himself, then to a woman young enough to be his daughters. A premarital liaison at his last 2 marriages would give him 9 children, 4 of whom would die in infancy. It was a private life of above-average turbulence, at least for a provincial customs officer. He had already fathered an illegitimate child in the 1860s. In 1873, he married Anna Glassel, then aged 50. It is unlikely to have been a love match. The marriage to a woman 14 years older than himself had almost certainly a material motive, since Anna was relatively well off and in addition had connections with the civil service. Maybe that's how he got the customs job that he had. I don't know. Within a short time, if not from the outset, Anna became ill. This is kind of weird, so she could have been ill from the outset, whatever. Her illness could not have been helped by the knowledge of the affair Alois was conducting by the later 1870s with Franziska, or Fanny, Matzelberger. Fanny was a young maid at the Gasthaus where the Hitlers lived. By 1880, Anna had finally had enough and was granted legal separation. That's funny how all these maids are getting just banged out left and right. Like, Clara Palsy, she's a maid. This chick who Alois has an affair with and ends up hooking up with, she's one of his maids. Apparently Alois's mother was a maid. Like, I guess that was the thing back then. Have kids with your maids. So anyway, Alois now lived openly with Fanny, one of whose first acts was to insist that Clara Palsy, a year older than she was and evidently regarded as a potential rival for Alois's favors, should leave the Hitler household. So you see, like, they have like all of these details. During her illness, Fanny had been moved to the fresh air of the countryside outside Braunau for someone to look after his two young children. Alois turned straight away to Clara Palsy and brought her back to this place where they all lived. While Fanny was dying, Clara became pregnant. Since they were officially second cousins, a marriage between Alois and Clara needed the dispensation of the church. After a wait of 4 months, in which Clara's condition became all the more evident, the dispensation finally arrived from Rome in late 1884. And the couple were married on 7th January 1885. The wedding ceremony took place at 6 o'clock in the morning, and then they give a bunch of more details. Now, as I said, the reason why I wanted to cover all of that is because I found the amount of detail that they put into all of these other people fascinating. They put all of this detail into all of these other theories of theirs, but when it comes to the theory about Hitler's grandmother working in Vienna, they kind of just gloss over it. They provide zero details. So when it comes to Graz, they say with certainty that she was never in Graz. This is when it comes to the theory about Hitler's mother having a child with a Jew in Graz. They provide all these details about Graz. They provide the details about there not being a Jew named Frankenberger in Graz. They provide another family. They provide details for another family in Graz, the Frankenfritters, or whatever the hell they're called. And they provide details even about that family having a 10-year-old son, or a son that would have been 10 years old at the time of the conception of Alois. They provide all of those details, but they can't say with certainty when it comes to Hitler's grandmother having a child with a Jew in Vienna, or specifically a Rothschild in Vienna. When it comes to that story, they don't outright deny it. They don't say, oh, there's no evidence that she was never in Vienna. They don't say, oh, well, there wasn't a Rothschild in Vienna at the time of her conception. They don't address any of those points. They provide zero details when countering that theory. And I found that to be very important. Now, the rest isn't important, okay? There's enough information there for us to work with. So anyway, now let's look at some other information. Should I start here? Where should I start? You know what? I'm going to start... Let's start first with the claim by this, the New York Times, or by that book, that there was no proof that Hitler's grandmother was in Graz. So I just want to point out that this is Austria, within like this boundary here. Let's see if we back out. You see, this is Austria. So if you zoom in here, Graz is down here, way the hell down here. Now, if you look into where Hitler's mother was from, she was actually from up here. Is this his mother? Yeah, Strones. Because the other people are from Spidel or some shit like that. So yeah, she's from up here. And remember, this is like, there's like a district here called it's called Lower Austria. Now, Lower Austria actually comprises this whole district, including Vienna. Graz is not part of the state of Austria, which I find very important. Now, here is where the Heidlers are from, which is actually pretty close. Like they said, I think they said it was like 15 miles away. So she's from here, just east of Zwettl. I don't know how you would pronounce that. And he's west of Zwettl over here. Now, this is all, though, all of this is in the state, I don't know what I just did there. It's all in the state of Lower Austria, which comprises Vienna. And that's really important. Remember, Hitler wanted to go to Vienna to supposedly be an artist.
And Hitler's father went there at a young age to supposedly continue his leather work.
It's very unlikely that she was a maid here in Graz, in a totally different state of Austria, way the hell away. Like, why go to Graz and be a maid here when she can easily go to Vienna, which would probably have a lot more money and a lot more job opportunities to be a maid, and it'd be much closer to her, right? So that's an important point to be made. Now, the claim is that the other claim, remember, the New York Times made that claim, that some claim that Hitler's father had been sired by a Baron Rothschild. Now, the problem with Baron Rothschild is Baron is just a title for a Rothschild. I don't think that there is a specific Baron Rothschild. It's a title. Baron Rothschild is a title. So I don't know about this whole Baron Rothschild. Maybe I don't know enough about the Rothschild family to know that there is a specific Baron Rothschild. Now, what's interesting is that the New York Times never says that there's no evidence of this. And actually, when we look at the map, if she was a maid in any city, she would probably most likely be a maid in Vienna, in the largest city within the state of Austria that she's in. But anyway, let's move on to the Jerusalem Post. Studies suggest Adolf Hitler's paternal grandfather was Jewish. Hitler's right hand, Hans Frank, claimed to have discovered that the Führer's grandfather was indeed Jewish. So this goes back to the claim in the book that the New York Times covers by Hans Frank, the guy who supposedly made these claims when he was awaiting his execution. So this study focuses on what Hans Frank said about Hitler's grandmother having a child from a Jew from Graz. And basically what this study does is it proves that there were indeed Jews living in Graz. Now, this study also does another thing, which is it also supposedly proves that the guy who made the claim, which was a historian, it wasn't just some random guy, but supposedly it was like a respected historian who made the claim that there was no Jews living in Graz. And when this guy made that claim that there was no Jews living in Graz, it was accepted as truth for a long time, and that's why a lot of people would say that no, Hitler's not Jewish, there's no truth to that story. Basically, this study proves that there is some truth to that story, in that there were Jews living in Graz before 1860. So that's one thing that this study proves. The other thing that the study proves is that the guy who made that claim was a Nazi sympathizer. However, what this study doesn't do, this study does not prove that Hitler's grandmother was in Graz. According to the other historians, there's no proof that his grandmother was ever a maid in Graz. And another thing that this study doesn't prove is it doesn't prove that the Frankenbergers existed. Because remember, it's also been claimed by historians that that there were never a family of Frankenbergers living in Graz.
So I see this whole study just as modern-day propaganda meant to further muddy the waters. I mean, it's a study that's studying or looking into demonstrably erroneous claims.
Interestingly enough, though, moving on to more information, there is another study that suggests Adolf Hitler had Jewish and African ancestors. Adolf Hitler may have had Jewish and African ancestors according to a recent DNA study done by Belgian researchers. So in August of 2018, there's this article published by History, and it's claiming that they did a DNA study on Hitler's surviving family members. Now, something that bothers me is what this thing starts off by saying. So it says the following. Some have suggested that his father, Alois, born to an unwed woman named Maria Schickelgruber, was the illegitimate child of Leopold Frankenberger, a young Jewish man whose family employed her as a maid. And then it just basically gives that information. Others have claimed that Alois's biological father was also the grandfather of Hitler's mother, Clara Pölzl, making Adolf the product of an incestuous marriage. Now, this is why I wanted to read all of that information from the book that's archived by the New York Times. Because it's not just some have suggested this, a very specific person suggested this, and it's not others have claimed this. This isn't a claim. This is what the facts would be if the official record is true. If this person really was his grandfather, then he is the product of an incestuous marriage and of an incestuous relationship. So this isn't what others have claimed. This is, historically what is there. And it's not just some have suggested this. A very specific person suggested this. So anyway, to unravel the mystery of the Führer's roots, the Belgian journalist, this douchebag, and this other douchebag, a historian, who has written extensively about Hitler and his ancestors. Okay. So anyway, what they did was the duo collected saliva samples from 39 of the infamous dictator's living relatives, including a great-nephew, Alexander Stewart Houston, who lives in New York, and some other douchebag. Tests were then conducted to reveal the sample's principal haplogroups, which are sets of chromosomes that geneticists use to define specific populations. So anyway, they did this with 39 of the dictators of Hitler's current living relatives.
Now, there's a couple of things about this study and this whole article that really annoy the hell out of me. First of all, it's yet another mainstream article out there talking about this completely erroneous story regarding Leopold Frankenberger and Graz. And this actually makes me think even more that this whole story about Leopold Frankenberger and Graz was a completely made-up story designed to muddy the waters and discredit the story about the Rothschilds. Now, the second thing about this study that bothers me in this whole article is that it makes no reference to the Rothschilds. And this is the next thing that I thought about, which was, why can't this be done? Why can't they take the DNA from living Rothschilds from the Austrian side of the family, why can't they take DNA from them and then DNA from living Hitler relatives and see if there's a relationship, see if they're cousins?
Let's move on to our next puzzle piece. This is an article that has been archived by a .gov. I don't know which government this is. It's trove.nla.gov.au/newspaper/article and then that number. Here's the whole URL if you want to look this URL up yourself. So this article is titled Hitler's Grandfather Was a Jew. Secret dossier now claimed to be reason for Nazi hate. Hitler's grandmother was a servant maid in the Rothschild mansion in Vienna, and his mother was the illegitimate daughter of a Rothschild. That is the psychological explanation of Hitler's fanatical hatred of the Jews and his brutal treatment of the Austrian Rothschilds. Now, what's interesting is that in this article, well, actually it's not an article, it's a book review, and I'm going to get into that in a second. What's interesting is that this newspaper makes the claim that it's his mother and not his father who is the illegitimate daughter of a Jew, specifically of a Rothschild. Now, this is a book review. It's a book review specifically of this book, Inside the Gestapo. Now, I don't have this book, so I don't know if the claim in this book is about his mother or his father. However, there's this David Icke article about Adolf Hitler, titled Was Hitler a Rothschild by David Icke. Now, this article references a book that supposedly uses this book for information. So when you scroll down this article a little bit, David Icke references this book by Walter Langer, this book called The Mind of Hitler by psychoanalyst Walter Langer. And he says that in this book, Langer claims that Hitler not only was he supported by the Rothschilds, but then he also claims that he was a Rothschild. And I'll be going into this claim that Hitler was supported by the Rothschilds in a second. because this is a claim that the Rothschilds strongly deny to this day. And so anyway, so David Icke, he quotes this thing. He says that, like, oh yeah, according to this book by this psychoanalyst, Hitler was a Rothschild. And then he says, and then he specifically says, he talks about Hitler's father. And he's oh yeah, here we go, right here. He says that Langer writes Adolf's father. So Langer, in his book, he's specifically talking about Adolf's father. And then David Icke says that Langer's information came from the high-level Gestapo officer Hans-Jürgen Kohler, published in 1940 under the title Inside the Gestapo. So he's saying, according to David Icke is saying that Langer referenced this book that is being covered in this article. Where is it? Scheisse. That he covered this article, and that according to him, it was his father. So for some reason, this article here confuses it and talks about Hitler's mother. And I find that to be very interesting. So anyway, let's ignore the mother. Let's say that that is a typo, it's a misprint, it's not intentional disinformation, right? Alright, this is yet another post-recording edit. For some reason, when I was editing this, I got to this part in the video, and there was a little monkey on my back that told me I needed to further research this book that David Icke references. And that's the book by Walter Langer, by the psychoanalyst Walter Langer, called The Mind of Hitler. And I'm really, really happy I researched this book, or at least I did a little bit more research into this book, because this book has a lot of very juicy material, as you're about to see. So first of all, this isn't just some book. This book is actually the product of a report that was commissioned by the OSS. Here, I'm just going to read the beginning. This is at the start of the book. Probing the strange psyche of Adolf Hitler. During the dark years of World War II, there was no one who fully understood Nazi Germany's leader or could predict his behavior. No one except Walter C. Langer, an American psychiatrist who was asked in 1943 to prepare this psychological analysis of Hitler for the OSS and the Allies. Now, the OSS is the Office of Strategic Services. By drawing on intelligence reports, interviewing people who had known Hitler, and studying his writing, Dr. Langer was able to make astonishing predictions about Hitler's future conduct, which were borne out in history. Here is the most fascinating and significant exploration ever made into the unconscious conflicts behind the rise and fall of Adolf Hitler. So apparently this report was actually classified after it was conducted, and then this book, The Mind of Hitler, was published after it was declassified by the brother of Walter Langer, because by the time it was declassified, Walter Langer had passed away. And there are some really, really amazing things in this book. But before I get into them, I just want to show how well researched this book is. It has a very, very extensive bibliography. Its bibliography, as you can see, is very dense. Yeah, 22-page bibliography. Very extensively researched and very well written. Now, unfortunately, I only did a quick speed reading through this to find the quote that David Icke mentioned in his article. That's actually a big reason why I decided to further research this book, is because David Icke quotes the book, but he never actually gave a page number. So I was really interested as to exactly what the author had said. So I did a quick speed reading through to just kind of find that point, which was on page, I think it's on page like 110. So I have not finished this book, although I do plan on ordering this book, the physical copy, and then reading the entire thing. And then after I read the entire thing, I'll probably make a video specifically about this book. But for now, I'm just going to share some parts of the book that I had quickly read through that I found very interesting. So right at the start of the book, it says this. At the time of the reoccupation of the Rhineland in 1936, Hitler made use of an extraordinary figure of speech in describing his own conduct. He said, "I follow my course with the precision and security of a sleepwalker." Even at that time, it struck the world as an unusual statement for the undisputed leader of 67 million people to make in the midst of an international crisis. Hitler meant it to be a kind of reassurance for his more weary followers, who questioned the wisdom of his course. It seems, however, that it was a true confession, and had his weary followers only realized its significance and implications, they would have had grounds for far greater concern than that aroused by his proposal to reoccupy the Rhineland. So, what I found very interesting about this statement, of course, this author is reading into it, and his theory is that this statement was made to reassure his weary followers. And this author says that it actually was a true statement. Now, I haven't read the full book to understand why the author said that this is a true statement, like the exact perspective of the author. But from my perspective, this is, to me, Hitler saying that he's actually not putting conscious effort into what he's doing, that he's actually just a sleepwalker following orders or following another's voice or direction. This is how I see this. This is Hitler admitting that he's not the one consciously in charge of himself. Let's move on to this next paragraph. So I found it interesting that at the end of that paragraph, the author of this book makes the assertion that, and this is 1943, this is before the whole Holocaust story came out and all of that stuff. So the author actually says, he, referring to Hitler, will go down in history as the most worshipped and the most despised man the world has ever known. So anyway, the next paragraph is also very interesting. Many people have stopped and asked themselves, is this man sincere in his undertakings, or is he a fraud? Certainly, even a fragmentary knowledge of his past life warrants such a question, particularly since our correspondents have presented us with many conflicting views. At times, it seemed almost inconceivable that a man could be sincere and do what Hitler has done in the course of his career. And yet, all of his former associates, whom we have been able to contact, as well as many of our most capable foreign correspondents, are firmly convinced that Hitler actually does believe in his own greatness. Fox reports that Hitler said to this guy during these interviews, this is what Hitler said, "Do you realize that you are in the presence of the greatest German of all time? It makes little difference for our own purpose whether he actually spoke these words or not at this particular time, as alleged. In this sentence, he has summed up in a very few words an attitude that he has expressed to some of our informants in person. To this guy, for example, he once said, quote, 'But I do not need your endorsement to convince me of my historical greatness.' To this other guy, who once took the liberty of saying that he was afraid that Hitler was mistaken, he said, quote, 'I cannot be mistaken. What I do and say is historical.' And of course it cites that. And then it goes on to say that many other people have reported such things coming from Hitler, or such statements. And then it goes on, 'There seems, therefore, to be little room for doubt concerning Hitler's firm belief in his own greatness. We must now inquire into the source of this belief.' So this is pretty much, it's the start of the book, and this is a major point in the book. It's trying to discover why Hitler believes in his own greatness. And then it says, 'Almost all writers have attributed Hitler's confidence to the fact that he is a great believer in astrology, and that he is constantly in touch with astrologers who advise him concerning his course of action. This is almost certainly untrue. All of our informants who have known Hitler rather intimately discard the idea as absurd.' And then the author actually reveals where this story or where these rumors actually come from. These stories probably originated in the very early days of the party. According to Strasser, during the early 1920s, Hitler took regular lessons in speaking and in mass psychology from a man named Hanusessen, maybe I'm pronouncing his name incorrectly, whatever, who was also a practicing astrologer and fortune teller. He was an extremely clever individual who taught Hitler a great deal concerning the importance of staging meetings to obtain the greatest dramatic effect. As far as can be learned, he never had any particular interest in the movement or any say on what course it should follow. It is possible that Hanusessen had some contact with a group of astrologers referred to by this guy who were very active in Munich at this time. Through Hanusessen, Hitler too may have come into contact with this group, for von Wiegand, the guy who mentioned this group, writes, "When I first knew Adolf Hitler in Munich in 1921 and 1922, he was in touch with a circle that believed firmly in the portents of the stars. There was much whispering of the coming of another Charlemagne and a new Reich. How far Hitler believed in these astrological forecasts and prophecies in those days, I never could get out of Der Führer. He neither denied nor affirmed belief. He was not averse, however, to making use of the forecasts to advance popular faith in himself and his then young and struggling movement." And then the author says that it is quite possible that from these beginnings, the myth of his association with astrologers has grown. This just shows how well researched this book really is. This author brings up this rumor that Hitler followed astrologers around, or that he took advice from astrologers and such. And then the author says, okay, well, the truth of this rumor actually comes from this story. So this author is clearly not a conspiracy theorist. This is a legitimate book written by a legitimate psychiatrist. So then, after addressing that rumor or that information, the author then says the following: "Although Hitler has done considerable reading in a variety of fields of study, he does not in any way attribute his infallibility or omniscience to any intellectual endeavor on his part." So after this, pretty much this author says that Hitler frowns on such sources. Like, he frowns on people that try to make themselves smarter. He frowns on people who think that they're intellectuals. And then it kind of gives a couple quotes, and one quote is, "The intellect has grown autocratic and has become a disease of life." And then, it kind of covers this idea that Hitler believes himself to be great because he's a learned person. It kind of addresses this, and it says, no, this isn't why Hitler believes himself to be great. And then the author goes on to write, "Hitler's guide is something different entirely. It seems certain that Hitler believes that he has been sent to Germany by providence and that he has a particular mission to perform. He is probably not clear on the scope of this mission beyond the fact that he has been chosen to redeem the German people and reshape Europe." Very important, reshape Europe. "Just how this is to be accomplished is also rather vague in his mind. But this does not concern him greatly because a, quote, inner voice communicates to him the steps he is to take. This is the guide that leads him on his course with the precision and security of a sleepwalker." See, that inner voice, very important. And then it gives these quotes from Hitler. "I carry out the commands that Providence has laid upon me." For those who don't know, providence is like God's will. It's God's divine providence. "Has laid upon me. No power on earth can shake the German Reich now. Divine providence has willed it that I carry out through the fulfillment of this Germanic task." And then it gives this other quote, "But if the voice speaks, then I know the time has come to act." It's all very, very interesting shit about Hitler. I hope you guys all find it interesting. I know the video is like over an hour long now, well over an hour long. So I hope you're all enjoying the information as much as I'm enjoying finding out this information and sharing it with you all. It is this firm conviction that he has a mission and is under the guidance and protection of Providence that is responsible in large part for the contagious effect he has had on the German people. Alright, now I just want to quickly digress and talk about religion in Nazi Germany, because part of my theory as to what exactly went on with World War I and World War II and all of this conspiracy nonsense, part of my theory has to do with religion. So let's look at religion in Nazi Germany. A census in May 1939, 6 years into the Nazi era and after the annexation of mostly Catholic Austria and mostly Catholic Czechoslovakia into Germany, indicates that 54% of the population considered itself Protestant, 40% considered itself Catholic, 3.5% self-identified as believing in God, and 1.5% as atheists. Protestants voted for the Nazi Party and made up its membership more than Catholics did. Well, I mean, shit, if most of the country was fucking Protestant, then of course this would be the case. But I can see why, based off of Hitler's conjecture, based off of the way that Hitler spoke, why Protestants would have made up most of the Nazi Party. So let's go on. Now, this is sort of not really all of that important. I guess it's sort of important. Let's just read this too. Smaller religious minorities, such as the Jehovah's Witnesses and the whatever faith, were banned in Germany, while the eradication of Judaism was attempted along with the genocide of its adherents. The Salvation Army and the Seventh-day Adventist Church both disappeared from Germany, while astrologers, healers, fortune tellers, and witchcraft were all banned. However, the small pagan German faith movement supported the Nazis. Some religious minority groups had a more complicated relationship with the new state. For example, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints withdrew its missionaries from Germany and Czechoslovakia in 1938, but German LDS church branches were permitted to continue to operate throughout the war. However, they were forced to make some changes in their structure and teachings. So then it talks about the different Nazi ranks or whatever. The next most important thing, I believe, is right here. Nazism wanted to transform the subjective consciousness of the German people, its attitudes, values, and mentalities, into a single-minded, obedient national community. The Nazis believed that they would therefore have to replace class, religious, and regional allegiances. Under the Nazification process, Hitler attempted to create a unified Protestant Reich Church from Germany's 28 existing Protestant churches. The plan failed, of course it would, if you understand Protestants, that would never work, and was resisted by the Confessing Church. Persecution of the Catholic Church in Germany followed the Nazi takeover. Hitler moved quickly to eliminate political Catholicism. Amid harassment of the Church, the Reich Concordat Treaty with the Vatican was signed in 1933 and promised to respect church autonomy. Hitler routinely disregarded the Concordat, closing all Catholic institutions whose functions were not strictly religious. Clergy, nuns, and lay leaders were targeted, with thousands of arrests over the ensuing years. The church accused the regime of fundamental hostility to Christ and his church. Historians resist, however, a simple equation of Nazi opposition to both Judaism and Christianity. Nazism was clearly willing to use the support of Christians who accepted its ideology, and Nazi opposition to both Judaism and Christianity was not fully analogous in the minds of the Nazis. Many historians believe that Hitler and the Nazis intended to eradicate Christianity in Germany after winning victory in the war. Now, I strongly agree with that. I think that's actually why he was trying to unify the 28 existing Protestant churches, because he realized that the Protestant churches would probably put up the most resistance. Now, let's quickly look at the religion of Germany today. So this is really interesting. Germany went from only 1.5% as identifying with atheism or claiming to be atheist Today, irreligion, which I believe is what atheists are called in this Wikipedia page, irreligion now makes up 40%. And now remember, before Germany, 54% was considered Protestant. Of the remaining Germans that consider themselves Christian, half of them actually identify with Catholicism. About half of Christians in Germany are Catholics, mostly Latin Catholics. Catholicism is stronger in the southern and the western part of the country. Now, this is probably because the eastern part fell under the Soviets. Now, this goes on to then inform us about half belongs to the Evangelical Church of Germany. Now, this Church of Germany, if you look it up, it's kind of like a Protestant church. It's made up of different Protestant groups. It's a federation of 20 Lutheran, Reformed, Calvinist, and United Protestant regional churches. Now, what's interesting is if you look at irreligion in Germany, it says the following. Irreligion is prevalent in Germany. Following near universal adoption of Christianity, religious traditions in Germany were weakened by the rule of the Nazi Party during World War II, and the subsequent rule of the Socialist Unity Party in East Germany during the Cold War. As of 2020, approximately 40% of Germans are irreligious, with a significantly higher concentration of irreligious citizens in East Germany. And then it lets us know Eastern Germany, which was historically Protestant, is perhaps the least religious region in the world. And this is really important. I'm kind of stressing all of this because, as you're going to see, it's a really important part, or it's a major part of my theory as to what I believe was really happening here.
And then the author goes on to write, many people believe that this feeling of destiny and mission have come to Hitler through his success. This is probably false. Later in our study, part 5, we will try to show that Hitler has had this feeling for a great many years, although it may not have become a conscious conviction until much later. Okay, so a couple pages later, the author sort of proves that Hitler had had this belief of an inner voice as far back as World War I. So this is something that Hitler said about his experience in World War I. Then, too, Hitler has reported several incidents during the war, this is during World War I, that proved to him that he was under divine protection. The most startling of these is the following. I was eating my dinner in a trench with several comrades. Suddenly, a voice seemed to be saying to me, "Get up and go over there." It was so clear and insistent that I obeyed automatically, as if it had been a military order. I rose at once to my feet and walked 20 yards along the trench, carrying my dinner in its tin can with me. Then I sat down to go on eating, my mind being once more at rest. Hardly had I done so when a flash and deafening report came from the part of the trench I had just left. A stray shell had burst over the group in which I had been sitting, and every member of it was killed. And then it goes on to say, then also there was the vision he had while in hospital at Pacewalk, suffering from blindness allegedly caused by gas. When I was confined to bed, the idea came to me that I would liberate Germany, that I would make it great. I knew immediately that it would be realized. I'm surprised he didn't say that I would make it great again. Make Germany great again. So then it goes on to say the following. These experiences must later have fit in beautifully with the views of the Munich astrologers, and it is possible that, underneath, Hitler felt that if there was any truth in their predictions, they probably referred to him. But in those days, he did not mention any connection between them or dwell on the divine protection he believed he possessed. Perhaps he felt that such claims at the beginning of the movement might hinder rather than help it. So then the author goes on to talk about how Hitler would make connections between himself and Jesus Christ, but not the Jesus Christ on a cross, but instead he would make references, or he would make connections, or he would relate himself to the Jesus that whipped the moneylenders in the temple. So this is what it says, right? When I came to Berlin a few weeks ago and looked at the traffic in the whatever, however that's pronounced, the luxury, the perversion, the inequity, the wanton display, and the Jewish materialism disgusted me so thoroughly that I was almost beside myself. I nearly imagined myself to be Jesus Christ when he came to his father's temple and found it to be taken by the money changers. I can well imagine how he felt when he seized a whip and scourged them out. During this speech, according to this guy, he swung his whip around violently as though to drive out the Jews and the forces of darkness, the enemies of Germany and German honor. So that's how Hitler would relate to some of his audiences. He would try to relate himself as Jesus Christ. So then this part ends, and actually, before I even say this, I should have told you guys that this book is set up in different parts. The first part is, I believe, how Hitler perceived himself. Then the second part is how, the German people perceived him. And then the third part is, how another group perceived him. And then the fourth part is, the psychoanalytical perception of Hitler. So the end of this part sort of ends like this. A survey of all the evidence forces us to conclude that Hitler believes himself destined to become an immortal Hitler, chosen by God to be the new deliverer of Germany and the founder of a new social order for the world. This is so freaking important. It's unbelievable. He firmly believes this and is certain that in spite of all the trials and tribulations through which he must pass, he will finally attain that goal. The one condition is that he follow the dictates of the inner voice that have guided and protected him in the past. This conviction is not rooted in the truth of the ideas he imparts, but is based on the conviction of his own personal greatness. Howard K. Smith makes an interesting observation. I am convinced that of all the millions on whom the Hitler myth had fascinated itself, the most carried away was Adolf Hitler himself. So now the next part, the parts that I will be showing you, I believe come from part 2 of this book, which is how other people perceived Hitler. And in this part, it informs us the following. Hitler, from a physical point of view, is not, however, a very imposing figure. Certainly not the Platonic idea of a great fighting leader or the deliverer of Germany and the creator of a new Reich. In height, he is a little below average. His hips are wide and his shoulders relatively narrow. His muscles are flabby, his legs short, thin, and spindly, the latter being hidden in the past by heavy boots and more recently by long trousers. He has a large torso and is hollow-chested to the point where it is said that he has his uniforms padded. From a physical point of view, he could not pass the requirements of his own elite guard. His dress in the early days was no more attractive. He frequently wore the Bavarian mountain costume of leather shorts with white shirt and suspenders. These were not always too cleaned, and with his mouth full of brown, rotten teeth and his long, dirty fingernails, he presented rather a grotesque picture. At that time, he also had a pointed beard, and his dark brown hair was parted in the middle and pasted down flat against his head with oil. Nor was his gait that of a soldier. It was a very ladylike walk, dainty little steps. Every few steps, he cocked his right shoulder nervously, his left leg snapping up as he did so. He also had a tic in his face that caused the corner of his lips to curl upwards. When speaking, he always dressed in a common-looking blue suit that robbed him of all distinctiveness.
At the trial following the unsuccessful beer haul, this guy, who saw him for the first time, asked himself, was this provincial dandy with his slick dark hair, his cutaway coat, his awkward gestures and glib tongue, the terrible rebel? He seemed for all the world like a traveling salesman for a clothing firm. Nor did he, this he is Hitler, make a much better impression later on. Dorothy Thompson, upon her first meeting, described him in the following terms. He is formless, almost faceless, a man whose countenance is a caricature, a man whose framework seems cartilaginous, without bones. He is inconsequent and voluble, ill-posed and insecure. He is the very prototype of the little man. Smith also found him, quote, the apotheosis of the little man, funny-looking, self-conscious, and unsure of himself. It may be supposed that this is only the judgment of American journalists who had a different standard of masculine beauty. However, while testifying as a witness in the law court in 1923, Professor Max von Gruber of the University of Munich, the most eminent eugenicist in Germany, stated, "It was the first time I had seen Hitler close at hand. Face and head of inferior type, crossbreed, low receding forehead, ugly nose, broad cheekbones, little eyes, dark hair. Expression not of a man exercising authority in perfect self-command, but of a raving excitement. At the end, an expression of satisfied egotism." So this is all really important, that Hitler is this little pathetic man. And, my theory is that whoever groomed him, whatever forces groomed him, were also aware of this, and we're probably also aware, usually little people like that, I'm not saying little in size, I'm saying little in, character and, people who are insecure, usually they're the easiest to manipulate. So the next thing that the author addresses here is the way that the German people perceived him. So this is what it says. Whatever effect Hitler's personal appearance may have had on the German people in the past, it is safe to assume that this has been greatly tempered by millions of posters pasted in every conceivable place, which shows the Führer as a fairly good-looking individual with a very determined attitude. In addition, the press, newsreels, and so forth are continually flooded with carefully prepared photographs showing Hitler at his very best. These have undoubtedly, in the course of time, blotted out any unfavorable impressions he may have created as a real person in the past. The physical Hitler most Germans know now is a fairly presentable individual. Okay, so I felt like all of that information was all very important, but now I'm going to get to the very, very important information in this article, which has to do with the part that David Icke quoted. Now, as I said already, the reason why I undertook this endeavor to research this book more is because I didn't like the quote that David Icke presented. There's clearly grammatical issues with this quote. This quote has clearly been tampered with. And like I said, David Icke does not give the page number for this quote. But interesting, right after this, David Icke quotes the book that this guy cited from. And when he quotes from the other book, he gives the page number for that book. So that really bothered me. Finally, on page 109, I found this quote. And unsurprisingly, because David Icke is not to be trusted either, David Icke totally fucking butchered this quote. Let me show you how he butchered it, okay? So David Icke's quote starts off by saying the following. Adolf's father, Alois Hitler, was the illegitimate son of Maria Annel Schicklgruber. It was generally supposed that the father of Alois Hitler was Johann Georg Hitler. Okay, so these first two sentences are right here on page 109. Adolf's father, Alois Hitler, was the illegitimate son of Maria Ann Schicklgruber. It is generally supposed that the father of Alois Hitler was Johann Georg Hitler, a miller's assistant. See, now the next sentence here is Alois, however, was not legitimized and he bore his mother's name until he was 40 years of age when he changed it to Hitler. So here, we know we did all of that information, we did all of that research already. So here, it goes into that story. But the David Icke quote, it goes right into saying the following. There are some people who seriously doubt that Johann George was the father of Alois. And then it gives this totally jacked up, can't be correct. So clearly there's something wrong here, because that's not what this author goes on to write. However, I find the rest of this quote, this part here that starts off with, there are some people who seriously doubt this, I found the rest of this on the following paragraph. So David Icke, he cuts out all of this information that's on that paragraph, which we already went over. Good thing we already went over that, so we don't have to go over it. And then he jumps to the second paragraph. Now, interestingly, though, is David Icke, he goes into the second paragraph, but then he leaves out a whole bunch of important information, which I'm going to read. So let me just read this entire paragraph, because David Icke, his quote in this article, this David Icke article, totally butchers this paragraph. So let's read it, okay? There are some people who seriously doubt that Johann Georg Hitler was the father of Alois. Thyssen and Kohler, these two guys, for example, claim that Chancellor Dollfuss had ordered the Austrian police to conduct a thorough investigation into the Hitler family. As a result of this investigation, a secret document was prepared that proved that Maria Anna Schicklgruber was living in Vienna at the time she conceived. At that time, she was employed as a servant in the home of Baron Rothschild. As soon as the family discovered her pregnancy, she was sent back to her home in Spital, where Alois was born. If it is true that one of the Rothschilds is the real father of Alois Hitler, it would make Adolf a quarter Jew. According to these sources, Adolf Hitler knew of the existence of this document and the incriminating evidence it contained. In order to obtain it, he precipitated events in Austria and initiated the assassination of Dollfuss. According to this story, he failed to obtain the document at that time since Dollfuss had secreted it and had told this person of its whereabouts so that in the events of his death, the independence of Austria would remain assured. Several stories of this general character are in circulation. Those who lend credence to this story point out several factors that seem to favor its plausibility. 1. That it is unlikely that the miller's assistant in a small village in this district would have very much to leave in the form of a legacy. So the first point is this guy's so concerned with leaving Hitler his legacy, but he had nothing to leave as a legacy. That's the first point that they make. Okay, the second point is that 2. That it is strange that Johann Hitler should not claim the boy until 35 years after he had married the mother and the mother had died. So this Johann Hitler is Johann Georg Hitler that it's referring to here, who was also dead at this point. That if the legacy were left by Hitler on the condition that Alois take his name, now this is the other Hitler, it would not have been possible for him to change it to Hitler. This is just simply making the point that, hey, this excuse that they give for this name change also doesn't make any sense, because they probably would have put a little bit more effort into making sure the name matched up. It's like, oh yeah, I want this guy to carry on my legacy, but he just got a different last name than me. But whatever. Point number 4, that the intelligence and behavior of Alois, as well as that of his 2 sons, is completely out of keeping with that usually found in Austrian peasant families. They point out that their ambitiousness and extraordinary political intuition are much more in harmony with the Rothschild tradition. This is a pretty good point here. I actually like this point because, remember, Alois was the first social climber in his family. It seems very odd that the bastard son of a poor housemaid would be so ambitious, and not just so ambitious, but ambitious to the point that he was ambitious. Number 5, that Alois Schicklgruber left his home village at an early age to seek his fortune in Vienna, where his mother had worked. Yeah, see, this is also very odd. The book that the New York Times archive has archived and that I have covered before, it made it as if this was normal. It's like, oh yeah, every young man at his age, continued their leather work in Vienna. So now this person is saying, or at least these people who lend credence to this theory, says this isn't normal. This is kind of unusual that Alois would leave his home, or at least leave his home village, at an early age to seek his fortune in Vienna, where his mother had worked. Number 6, that it would be peculiar for Alois Hitler, while working as a customs official in this place, to choose a Jew named Prince of Vienna to act as Adolf's godfather unless he felt some kinship with the Jews himself. Now, this is something that I did not know, and this to me is just groundbreakingly important information. That Alois Hitler, Hitler's father, had a Jew named Prince who was from Vienna to act as Adolf's godfather. So Adolf's godfather, or at least the guy who was acting as Adolf's godfather, which is actually also weird that he would have a Jew, because isn't like the godfather, like that whole thing, doesn't that have to do with like the Catholic religion? Like isn't the godfather like chosen like at the person's baptism? I don't really know everything about that, but to me this is just unbelievable information.
We're definitely onto something here.
Alrighty, after that rather long edit, I've decided to just re-record the entire end of this video, and I'm going to try to make it really fucking quick, because this video has taken way too much of my time, and probably way too much of your time too, so let's just get this shit over with. So this article that we left off with is pretty much telling this story about this Chancellor of Austria being killed. This is the guy who had the record searched for Hitler's family background, and then apparently he was killed, and then the file was passed to his successor, Schuschnigg, who continued the work started by Dollfuss. And then there's this whole story. This article, it gives this whole story, which is supposedly from a top-level Gestapo officer. Now, this top-level Gestapo officer in this article claims to have fled Germany to go to England from fear that his knowledge of this material, of this information, would get him killed. Now, some parts in the article, it just gives like some kind of ridiculous information. Like, some parts of the article is just like, it makes you really question whether or not this is a true story, or whether or not this is intentional disinformation or misinformation created by an officer in London. It's still worth the read, but once again, there was, according to the Mind of Hitler author, according to this guy, Walter C. Langer, there are several stories like this. So I believe if Hitler really is the grandson of a Rothschild, I believe they would intentionally do this. They would muddy the water with a bunch of different versions of the same story, which would basically completely muddy the water and then discredit all of the stories. This might be why this government, this .gov, this .gov.au, I don't know exactly what government that is. I guess I could figure it out, but I'm not going to figure it out. You guys can figure it out. I believe that this is why this government actually archived this article, this intentional disinformation, or this article that was covering a book that was providing intentional disinformation. And I don't even think the author of, I don't think Walter C. Langer, the author of The Mind of Hitler, I don't think he actually cited this. I think he cited this and many other stories, because when we were reading his book before, I'm not going to pull that up now, but when we were reading his book before, he actually didn't reference this guy. Like in that paragraph that I read, he references two other names. Maybe I'll just copy and paste that and put it into here. Thyssen and Kohler, these two guys, for example, claim that Chancellor Dollfuss, he mentions those two names. He doesn't mention this top-level Gestapo officer's name, or this supposed top-level Gestapo officer's name. So I find that really interesting. So I think that this story, or I think that this book, it's possible that this book is just intentional disinformation, something that was put out there to intentionally muddy the waters. Not necessarily important, though. I believe, actually, that all of this controversy can be put to rest by very simply taking the DNA of living Rothschilds and the DNA of living Hitlers, or Hitler's living relatives, and seeing if there's any sort of relationship. That's how easy this story can be laid to rest. Very simple. Get the Rothschilds of Austria, or any living Rothschilds of Austria that might be descendants of these Rothschilds, take their DNA, take the DNA of any living Hitlers that, there has to be some kind of blood connection. There can't be like, oh yeah, I'm a living relative of Hitler, but it was through marriage. Has to make sure that that's the case. And just very simply, okay, see if there's a relationship. You can do that today very easily. So anyway, the next piece of the puzzle that's very interesting is that Hitler's father's birthplace has been abandoned since World War II. Now, I'm sure many of you have heard these stories about Hitler pretty much destroying the town of his father's birthplace, but very few have actually probably researched it. So here is the information pertaining to that. So during World War II, Hitler actually had the village of his father's birthplace evacuated and then used for military exercises. So it's not like Hitler just went into his father's birthplace and then destroyed it without a reason. His reason was that he wanted it to be used for a place for military exercises. So at the time, Hitler was very aware that this was his father's birthplace. And not only was Hitler aware of this, but the people of this village were aware of this. And before Hitler had abandoned it or had it evacuated, the people in this town tried appealing to him to have him not evacuate the town by creating a memorial for his grandmother and by making Hitler an honorary citizen. So the people of this village tried really hard to not have it evacuated. But Hitler had it evacuated anyway, and then he had it used for military exercises, and one aspect of the military exercises involved blowing up many of the houses there. So they destroyed the whole place. Even more interesting is after the war ended, the Russians took it over, or the Soviets took it over, and the Soviets kept it a military exclusion zone until 1981. So that's the story of Hitler's father's birthplace. Completely destroyed and then abandoned for several decades. So if there are any clues left there, they have long since been removed. Okay, let's move our attention away from Hitler and now look at the Rothschild family. Let's see if it would make sense at all for Hitler to be the grandson of a Rothschild and for them to be connected at all via some grand conspiracy. So this is a Business Insider article. It's titled The Rothschild Gang, Shadow Conspiracy or Rumor. And the first paragraph informs us the following. The Rothschilds are the most famous banking family in history. In the 19th century, they lent money to kings and governments and funded both sides in the Napoleonic Wars. They once saved the Bank of England from collapse with their own money. Now, the only interesting thing that I really want to take from this article is that they admit, and this is something that they admit throughout the article, this is not a conspiracy statement, they admit that the Rothschilds funded both sides in the Napoleonic Wars. So this I find to be very important. Why? Well, because millions upon millions of people died in the Napoleonic Wars. So this, to me, tells us the kinds of people that the Rothschilds are. At least these, well, not all of the Rothschilds. Maybe there's one or two Rothschilds that aren't inherently evil. But at least the Rothschilds at this time were evil enough to fund both sides of a war. And some people will even argue that, this war wouldn't have been possible without them. So they funded both sides of a war that ended up with millions of people dying. According to some estimates, between 3.25 million people, and this is including military and civilian deaths, and 6.5 million people died during this war. So the Rothschilds, at least at this time, don't appear to care about getting blood on their hands. Now, there are debates about whether or not the Rothschilds also funded World War I. So I'm going to look at what the Rothschilds themselves say about World War I. Now, this is taken from the RothschildArchive.org website. This is a website that is, or at least was created by the Rothschilds and that is overseen by the Rothschild family. So let's look at what they admit to in this page here. So Rothschilds in the First World War. This is 1. Rothschilds in the First World War. The First World War and its aftermath changed the world forever. This is very important information here. This fact right here, that this changed the world forever. Because remember, Hitler said that he was destined to help change the world and reshape Europe and all that stuff. Because that's what it seems like the Rothschilds are really fascinated with, which was changing the world, was creating this new world order. Okay. So the Rothschild family, who through their businesses and marriages had helped to create modern Europe, were deeply affected by the crisis facing the world. So here it even acknowledges that the Rothschilds, or the Rothschild family, through their businesses and marriages, had helped create modern Europe. Okay, so they're acknowledging all of this, which I'm very thankful for them acknowledging, right? Like royalty, the Rothschilds were forced to abjure family solidarity and to give their loyalty to the countries of their adoption: England, France, Austria, and Germany. The family branches in London, Paris, Vienna, and Frankfurt did what they could to support the war effort. And they give this note, which is just some bogus note. It probably has some hidden message in it that, I can't decipher. Actually, I haven't even bothered to decipher. But they give this note. But all that matters is that here they straight up admit that they supported the war effort and that they were loyal to whatever country they were in. England, France, Austria, and Germany. So here you go. They funded both sides of the war. They deny that everywhere else that you read, they try to deny that, but on their own website, they acknowledge it in this very weird manner. Alright, now let's move on to World War II. Now, the evidence that I want to present with the Rothschild involvement with World War II actually begins with this New York Times article from June 20th, 1934. Very important date, 1934. So it's titled Rothschild. Actually, you know what? Let me just go right to the PDF of this article because it's better organized than that. So it says, Rothschild sees Hitler downfall. Says end will come if other countries continue to remain cold toward Germany. Hits Nazi propaganda. Agents are active here, French banker tells group of House members. So really interesting article. Okay, now it's a long article. This is already a pretty long documentary. If you guys want to find this article yourself and read it for yourself, by all means you can. Or if you don't want to pay for a New York Times subscription like I do, here, I'll just kind of go through the article like this, and then you can read the parts that I'm not going to read. Okay, now the part that I want to read in this article is actually here. It's this part of the article that is titled, Discusses Conditions in Germany. And this is this guy, of course, this Rothschild, discussing conditions in Germany. And this is what he said. He said, the, quote, most awful sight he had seen was the expulsion of Jews from their jobs. So this right here is propaganda. I'm going to prove this to be propaganda. Jews were not being expelled from their jobs, okay? Ration supplies to German natives, he added, were refused to Jews. This is also a complete lie. They were simply dying of starvation in the streets of Germany when they were not locked up in some concentration camp, he declared. Now remember, this is 1934 that he's making these claims, okay? Noting that the mark is falling, Baron de Rothschild added that Germany's gold reserves are being constantly reduced and will soon dwindle to nothing. I do not say it will be tomorrow, but I am certain that someday the Hitler regime will fall, he asserted. Baron de Rothschild said he did not believe there would be a recurrence of the recent inflation, but did believe, quote, that they will not have any purchasing power abroad, that they will not be able to buy as much raw material, and that this will mean a really strong depression in Germany. So Rothschild here is basically calling for a really strong depression in Germany. Now remember, a big thing that Hitler did when he was coming to power, a big talking point that he would make, is that the Jews were negatively affecting the German economy. So right here, this Rothschild, French banker, is calling basically for the other nations of the world to force a strong depression in Germany. And then he says, quote, "I am convinced that the Jews of this country who have gained such popularity here," and by this country he means the United States, "who are such fine Americans and have proved their patriotism and also have a love of humanity, will to a great extent help to relieve the world of this awful curse," Baron de Rothschild concluded. Now, for those who don't know, and this is important, this is going to play into this whole video, for those who don't know, the Rothschild family, or at least a Rothschild, not the specific Rothschild, but Baron Lionel Walter Rothschild, is the one that Israel was basically promised to. Now, the reason why that's important, the reason why it's important to acknowledge that the Rothschild family was involved in the establishing of Israel, they were involved in that entire Zionist movement, the reason why that is important has to do with this article that can be found on the JSTOR. So I found this article on the JSTOR. It was originally published by the University of California Press in the Journal of Palestine Studies. Now, this article has some very interesting things in it. Let's just read it, okay? So, The Secret Contacts, Zionism and Nazi Germany, 1933 to 1941. Anti-Semitism became official German government policy when Hitler was named Chancellor of the German Reich on January 30th, 1933. The spring of 1933 also witnessed the beginning of a period of private cooperation between Zionism and the German fascist regime to increase the inflow of German Jewish immigrants and capital to Palestine. So not just German Jewish immigrants, but capital as well to Palestine. The Zionist authorities succeeded in keeping this cooperation a secret for a long period, and only since the beginning of the 1960s have criticism of it been expressed here and there. The Zionist reaction has usually consisted of declarations that their one-time contacts with Nazi Germany were undertaken solely to save the lives of Jews. But the contacts were all the more remarkable because they took place at a time when many Jews and Jewish organizations demanded a boycott of Nazi Germany, including the Rothschilds. On the occasion of the 16th convention of the Israel Communist Party, a paper was submitted at the outset of the conference in which it was stated that, quote, "After Hitler's taking of power in Germany, when all anti-fascist forces in the world and the great majority of the Jewish organizations proclaimed a boycott against Nazi Germany, contacts and collaboration existed between Zionist leaders and the Hitlerite government." The paper quoted the Zionist official, this guy, who had been editor of this organ during the Second World War, as declaring during a symposium organized by the Israel newspaper, this name, in 1966, quote, that for the Zionist leadership, the rescue of Jews was not an aim in itself, but only a means, i.e., to establishing a Jewish state in Palestine. This is all really important, because if you look at the migration to Palestine before Hitler came to power, so at 1931, the Jewish population there was only 16.9%, and the population was at 1 million. Then you have an inflow of 300,000 migrants, about 300,000 migrants. Now keep in mind, between 1922 and 1931, you had less than 300,000 migrants going into Palestine at this time. So in almost a 10-year period before Hitler came into power, you had less than 300,000 people migrate there. And you actually had a slight decrease in the Jewish population there, at least in the percent of the population that is Jewish. You had a slight decrease. But then when Hitler came to power, this is 1936 here, this is definitely after the Zionists were collaborating with Hitler,
the population just shot up by over 300,000, or about a little over 300,000, and the Jewish population skyrocketed, almost freaking doubled here. Now, I actually learned about this originally in a college class that focused on the Middle East. And this was actually a point that my professor made, that without the rise of Hitler, the Jewish state, or the Jewish state of Israel that we know today, probably wouldn't exist in the manner that we know it today. Because not only did Hitler get Jews to migrate to Palestine, and not just like indirectly migrate to Palestine, because I'm sure a lot of this propaganda that was being spread by people like the Rothschild, I'm sure a lot of this also led to Jews wanting to migrate out of Germany. But Hitler straight up helped, or at least the Hitlerite government. They won't say directly that Hitler helped, because then it might look bad. But Hitler was a monarch, okay? It's not like the Hitler government was helping the Zionists without Hitler knowing, okay? Hitler had full knowledge of this. Okay, so not only did Hitler help Jews go over there, but according to them, they also had capital be sent over there. But also, according to Jews today, Jewish state of Israel that we know today wouldn't exist because they used the Holocaust to get a lot of funding for the state of Israel in its early days. So this article basically says the following. In this paper, I will argue that the Holocaust played an important role in the founding and long-term visibility of the state of Israel in three respects. The Holocaust motivated large numbers of immigrants to move to the new country, providing the necessary population. This wasn't the Holocaust. We saw that the Hitler government assisted with this. Secondly, the Holocaust enabled Israel to pressure Germany into supplying the economic base necessary to build infrastructure and support those immigrants. And finally, the Holocaust swayed world opinion so that the United Nations approved the State of Israel in 1948. Okay, so that's one way the Rothschild family was involved with the Hitler government early on. However, while researching this, I came across another way that the Rothschilds indirectly supported Hitler. Okay, so I came across, when I typed this question to Google, did the Rothschilds support the Nazis with finance? And this answer came up. The Rothschilds cleverly gave Hitler $21 million in the form of, quote, ransom, after they arrested Baron Louis Rothschild. They helped Stalin in a similar manner. This is something else that this person says in this comment that I think is just worth mentioning. So they helped Stalin in a similar manner. Stalin organized strikes while he was working for the Rothschilds. The Rothschilds would send money to Stalin through one of their agents, and Stalin would end the strike. Stalin and Hitler were both illegitimate offspring of the Rothschild family, which quietly spearheaded macroeconomic initiatives like world wars on behalf of the global central banking system that they helped to create. So that's just an answer that this person had left here. Now, I'm not saying that I believe all of this. However, this is very interesting, and it led me to the next bit of the puzzle. And that is this guy, Louis Nathaniel de Rothschild, this Baron Louis Nathaniel de Rothschild. Now, when I came across this guy, I was like, oh, wait a second. This is a Rothschild of Vienna. And I said to myself, maybe I can use this guy to find the supposed Baron Rothschild that was possibly Hitler's grandfather. And I actually did exactly that. So when we look at Louis's father, we have this guy. This is Louis's father, Albert von Rothschild. When we look at his father, which is Louis's grandfather, we get this guy, Ansel Solomon von Rothschild. And then it also refers to him as Baron here. Was an Austrian banker, founder of the whatever, and a member of the Vienna branch of the Rothschild family. So I believe if anybody was Hitler's grandfather, I believe it was this guy. And interestingly enough, when I was looking at this guy, Louis Nathaniel de Rothschild, I thought to myself, I said, hey, he actually kind of looks like Hitler. If you compare these two, let's see if I can get them close enough. I don't know, what do you guys think? Am I grasping at straws here that don't exist? Maybe I am, maybe I'm not. Now, what's interesting is if you do more research into what this guy said here about the Rothschilds giving Hitler $21 million in the form of ransom, you also come up with some pretty interesting things. So let's look at this article, how the Nazis demanded enormous ransom for the heir of the Rothschild dynasty. So Louis Nathaniel de Rothschild paid $400 million for his release. The guy was actually worth $10 billion, though, at that time. And by the way, that $400 million is just like being converted, because remember, the commenter said $21 million. It was $21 million. But this article informs us that this guy actually had a fortune that was worth over $10 billion. They ended up paying $500 million for his release. But what's more interesting is that the guy was actually warned before his arrest to get the hell out of the country. So this is what the article says. It says, although warned by friends, Louis Rothschild refused to leave Austria. Isn't that interesting? It's almost like he wanted to be arrested so that he would have to pay this ransom. So now the next thing that I want to look at is this Rothschild quote. This also just kind of gets into the mind of the Rothschilds. So this was from the founder of the Rothschild dynasty, Mayer Amschel Rothschild. So he said, "Give me control of a nation's money supply, and I care not who makes its laws." Very interesting quote. Okay, so now this other thing I want to just quickly look at before I give my own theory as to what I think happened and why I think this is really historically important for everybody to know. But before I do that, let me just go over some stuff here. So I found this to be interesting. While I was doing some more research, I came across this New York Times archived article, Rothschild Caught on Fraud Warrant. So apparently one of the Rothschilds, this David Rothschild, and I believe this David Rothschild is actually the brother of Louis Rothschild, because while reading these New York Times articles, I read somewhere that this David Rothschild was visited by his brother Louis while in jail, but it doesn't specify what Louis. It just says his brother Louis, and when I checked the Rothschild family tree, this is the only Louis Rothschild that I could find that was alive during that time period. But the problem is that when I look at the family tree, I can't find a brother connection to this guy. And also, when I look at his parents, if I go to his parents, I go to the parent of that, and I go to this guy's children, I don't find a David Rothschild. The thing that I found interesting here is that, so this David Rothschild was arrested for basically causing this bank collapse. And he caused this bank collapse by converting $200,000 of its funds, or of the Institute's funds, to his own use by means of dummy loans. Now, what's even more interesting is that there was a follow-up to this article almost a year later. This was in 1904. And then in 1905, you have this article. Where's the article at? You have this article, Rothschild Scandal Now Involves Many. Confession made by banker in prison were sent to Gruber. He is Matthew's friend. So then you have this article, which is a very confusing article that doesn't really give much. It just lets us know that this scandal was even larger than it may have appeared to be. This was in 1905. The thing that I find interesting and that I want to connect it to is I want to connect this to the Panic of 1907. I believe something was going on in the banking industry. I believe that these bankers were intentionally causing panic in the banks, which then came to full fruition in 1907. Now, what's interesting is that this 1907 bank run, or actually it wasn't a bank run, this Panic of 1907 that went from 1907 into 1908, it was actually used as part of the justification to create the Federal Reserve Bank that we have today, the private Federal Reserve Bank that we have today. This crisis, they blame this crisis on the United States not having a central bank. And then what happened after this crisis, or the result of this crisis, was that people like J.P. Morgan and the Rothschilds, a whole bunch of these bankers, they actually got together and they bailed out the United States economy. So I'm just going to quickly read from this lesson plan to summarize what happened. So the Panic of 1907 was a financial crisis set off by a series of bad banking decisions and a frenzy of withdrawals caused by public distrust of the banking system. J.P. Morgan, along with other wealthy Wall Street bankers, the Rothschilds, loaned their own funds to save the country from a severe financial crisis. But what happens when a single man, or a small group of men, have the power to control the finances of a country? In this lesson, students will learn about the Panic of 1907 and the measures Morgan used to finance and save the major banks and trust companies. Students will also practice close reading to analyze texts from the Pujo hearings, newspapers, and reactionary articles to develop an evidence-based argument about whether or not a money trust, a Morgan-led cartel, existed. So then, there's controversy about whether or not this money trust existed or whether or not there was a money cartel that existed that controlled the entire U.S. economy. Now, what's interesting is that when people are taught this in school, they focus on J.P. Morgan and such, but there's hardly ever a mention of the Rothschild family, which was also heavily involved in this. Now, what ended up happening is that this money trust, along with this the Panic of 1907, which again they blamed partly on the United States not having a central bank, they used these different crises, which were layered one on top of the other, to then push for a Federal Reserve Bank. And that's sort of what is talked about here in the National Archives, about how one of the answers for this, about how they created the Federal Reserve to lessen the control of the money trust over the nation's money supply. So this was completely 100% artificially driven to reshape the world. They created this panic with the banks, which then created this money trust, which would then lead to the Federal Reserve. And this just shows how clever these people are, how strategic they are, how much foresight they have,
and how evil they are, because a lot of people died in these panics. People would starve to death. People would lose everything in these artificially created crises.
Alright, although there's a bunch of other things I'd like to add to this video, I believe I've provided a sufficient amount of evidence to prove that Hitler was indeed, at least partly Jewish, and that there appears to be a cover-up of who his grandfather really was, a cover-up that involves muddying the waters with intentional disinformation. The question that remains is, why? I believe, this is just a belief of mine, it's just a theory, that it's because if people knew that Hitler had connections with the Rothschilds, this group that was trying to change the world, who admit that they were trying to change the world, or at least they weren't trying to change the world. I guess they don't admit to trying to change the world. They just admit that they did change the world. So if people knew that Hitler had connections with this group, they might be able to realize that World War II was really a staged war designed to reshape not just Europe, but the entire world. And when I say reshape Europe and the world, I mean to reshape not only the economies of the world, but more importantly, to reshape the minds of the world's population. Now, I believe that they helped reshape the minds of the people in the world by not only totally destroying many of these countries, but more importantly, by killing off the older, I don't want to say more religious parts of the population, because religious has this little connotation, but the older and wiser parts of the population. However, I believe they specifically were targeting the populations that followed or had a belief in the reformed religions like Protestantism and Calvinism. Like, people today have no idea what the religious world was like before Protestantism and Calvinism was wiped out. And I don't mean like totally wiped out, but buried. A lot of people in the world were Protestant, and a lot of people don't realize that these reformed religions ended the previous world order, the previous religious world order that was mostly ran by the remnants of the Holy Roman Empire. That's why I needed to show how drastically the religious population changed in Germany after World War II. I believe the reformed religions, especially the more extreme ones, like there's very extreme versions of Protestantism. I don't want to call them extreme, but they were
There were very well researched, very well thought out versions of Protestantism that took what Protestantism was proposing to the necessary extreme. And I believe these religions were and are a major threat to the club because these religions are all about the individual coming to God on their own accord and through their own understanding of the Bible.
They don't believe in any human authorities. They don't believe in the church or any of that stuff. They don't believe in the clergymen telling the people how to understand the Bible or anything like that.
For those who don't know, these Reformed religions, as I said just before, ended the previous religious world order that some might argue Charlemagne started with the creation of the Holy Roman Empire. And this is very interesting because I believe I mentioned it in this video. Honestly, I'm recording this video over like several weeks, so I kind of forgot everything that I had said earlier in the video. But I know that while researching this video, while reading The Mind of Hitler, the astrologers, or the people who talked about the astrologers that Hitler was in connection with, actually it wasn't astrologers, it was that one astrologer, he had said that there was talk about a new Charlemagne, or Charlemagne. Now, Charlemagne, for those who don't know, is the guy, he's basically the Roman emperor that started the Holy Roman Empire. Now, when they were talking about a new Charlemagne, or Charlemagne, however you pronounce his name, I believe they were talking about this. I believe that they were talking about a restructuring of the religious beliefs in the world, and Hitler had a huge part in that. Now, it would probably take another video to fully explain the threat that these Reformed religions pose to the club, but for now, I will say that my vaccine religious exemption letter was based on the ideas of these Reformed religions, and they can actually be used to exempt newborn babies from the many vaccines the government want to force in them before the age of 5. These Reformed religions are a major threat to the powers that shouldn't be. If you understand these Reformed religions and what they were arguing, you will understand why, after these Reformed religions came into being, the club tried so hard to destroy the idea of God. The last thing I'd like to mention in this video is the Albert Pike letter to Giuseppe Mazzini, and the fact that the Axis powers appear to have intentionally lost the war. Let's start with the Albert Pike letter to Giuseppe Mazzini, or Manzini, whatever. For those who don't know, this letter details the club's plan for 3 world wars, and I actually proved the authenticity of this letter in my video titled, The Truth About the Israel-Palestine Conflict. Here's a quick excerpt from that video.
Part in this book, this is like a French name, page 186, published 1895. So now, that was my next clue. I said, okay, well, maybe I can find this book. Unfortunately, I did find the book. So check this out. So I scrolled down. This is page 185. It says over here on the PDF 183, but you can see the PDF page numbers and the actual page numbers of the book do not add up. So 185 and 186 is totally blank. So there's a PDF of this book, which is from 1895, and which is supposed to have this letter, or at least the details of this letter, or the details of this plan, in this book. And look at that, they totally scrubbed the page. Okay, 187 is there. Every other page in this PDF was there, except for page 186. They straight up 1984'd this book.
It should be known that the book I was looking at before that 1895 book with the missing page was from 1925. So the letter can be authenticated to at least 1925. Even though I would say that no, the book with the missing page is full proof that at least the details of the letter existed as far back as 1895. Now let's quickly look at what the letter says about World War II. It says, the Second World War must be fomented by taking advantage of the differences between the fascist and the political Zionist. This war must be brought about so that Nazism is destroyed and that the political Zionism be strong enough to institute a sovereign state of Israel in Palestine. Now, the one thing that I will say is that the word Nazi, if you research this word, it doesn't appear until, I believe, the 1920s. I forget exactly what year in the 1920s. So I will understand the fact that some people might use the existence of this word in this letter to discredit this letter, or at least to say that this letter, there's no way it appeared before 1895. I'll understand those people, but those people don't understand that these people, they treat all of the propaganda that exists in our reality. So I can very easily see them using this word before it was used publicly, before it was used on the public, in a way that can be historically documented. So anyway, I digress. This war must be brought about so that Nazism is destroyed and that the political Zionism be strong enough to institute a sovereign state of Israel and Palestine. During the Second World War, international communism must become strong enough in order to balance Christendom, which would then be restrained and held in check until the time when we would need it for the final social cataclysm. This is exactly like what Hitler did. There's proof, we already covered the proof in the video, that the Nazis, Hitler specifically, because once again, Hitler's a dictator, there's no way that the Nazi party helped the Zionists populate Israel and also bring money to Israel. There's no way that the Nazi party did that without Hitler's involvement. So Hitler most definitely helped institute a sovereign state of Israel, or at least helped political Zionism to become strong enough to institute a sovereign state of Israel and Palestine. So Hitler actually fulfills that part of the letter. Hitler also fulfilled the other part of the letter that ensured that Nazism would be destroyed. Now, he did this by all of the military blunders that he took part in. Let's take a look at some of these military blunders, which can be found in this history article titled Top 10 Ways the Nazis Could Have Won World War II. Now, what's interesting is that these are just the top 10 ways the Nazis could have won World War II. There's a whole list of ways that the Nazis and the Axis powers could have won World War II. So, of course, to me, like one of the number one ways that the Nazis could have won the war, or one of the ways that Hitler intentionally lost the war, was by opening up an Eastern Front in the Soviet Union instead of invading and conquering Britain. So when Hitler invaded the Soviet Union in June of 1941, Britain was sort of on its last leg. It was very much on its last leg, let's just say that. And Hitler could have very easily have invaded Britain, and he could have very easily have conquered Britain, forced Britain to submit. And if he did that, he would have completely controlled his Western Front. He would have had virtually no enemies on his Western Front. Instead of doing that, he decided to invade the Soviet Union. Now, people who try to rationalize this action by Hitler will say that he had to do this because the Soviet Union was preparing to invade Germany, or was preparing to invade and conquer Europe. And if you look into this idea, you'll realize that it's a completely absurd idea that's based mostly on propaganda. The idea was that Hitler believed that when they went to invade Britain, that Russia would use that as an opportunity to essentially conquer all of Europe. This is an absurd idea because Russia would never be able to conquer all of Europe. There's just too much resistance that they would face. It wouldn't have been possible. But Hitler put this idea forth that Russia would do this and they would spread Bolshevism all throughout Europe and they would starve Europeans. Now, some facts that they put forward with this, like some people, I believe there's this like documentary that I'll be commenting on later. This documentary that's like a pro-Hitler documentary that's like, I think it's called Adolf Hitler, the Greatest Story Never Told, or something like that. Now, in this documentary, I believe they put forth this idea that Russia had like annexed a place where Hitler gets a lot of their oil from, and thus if Hitler didn't invade the Soviet Union, then the Soviet Union could have destroyed Germany economically. The fact is that they had signed a pact with each other. Germany and Russia had signed a pact with each other, not just a peace pact, they also had a trading pact. So this idea that Russia was denying Germany oil and these ideas, and this is why Germany had to invade Russia, is just completely absurd. To me, at least, it's completely absurd. Maybe there's facts involved in this that I haven't seen and analyzed. But as far as I've been able to figure out, Hitler invading the Soviet Union was a completely irrational act. And a little rebuttal that I have for people who put forth this idea that it was a rational act and that Stalin really was about to invade Europe and conquer Europe, well, if that was the case, if Stalin really was planning on doing this, then why was Hitler's blitzkrieg so effective? And not only so effective, but according to many, Stalin didn't even believe the intelligence. He actually thought that the intelligence that Germany was going to be invading Russia was just like propaganda that was supposed to spread division amongst the Russians and the Germans.
Fearing that Britain was planting disinformation to incite war between Germany and the USSR, Stalin disbelieved his own intelligence reports about the imminence of the invasion.
Alright, so the next thing that the Nazis could have done to win the war was to not declare war on the United States. At least not to declare war on the United States at the time that the United States had declared war with Japan. Now, people will say, oh, well, Germany had to do this because Germany had a pact with Japan. The problem that I have with that is that that pact that they had with each other, it never served any real purpose. They never really acted like allies. They never really coordinated attacks with one another, or at least it appears that way.
If the Japanese had attacked eastern India and coordinated it with the German advances in the Middle East before their invasion of the Soviet Union, the British Empire would have been severely threatened in India. But Japan and Germany throughout the war never behaved as if close allies.
Now, this brings me to my next blunder on this list, which is if Germany had coordinated with Japan on the invasion of the Soviet Union. Now, we have to remember, Germany invaded the Soviet Union in June of 1941. And when Germany invaded the Soviet Union, Japan did not help them. And the reason why Japan didn't help with the invasion of the Soviet Union is because just 2 months before the invasion of the Soviet Union, Japan had signed a neutrality pact with the Soviet Union, supposedly so that they can focus on securing their oil supply in Indonesia. So I have to ask, why did Germany, or Hitler, and Japan not communicate at all? Because by this time, by the time, or even before, Japan had signed a neutrality pact with Russia, Germany was already planning on their invasion of Russia. So as this neutrality pact is being signed, Hitler already has this thought of invading Russia. And some people, like I said, say he invaded Russia for the oil, for Russia's oil. Well, this could have been a perfect thing for Germany to communicate with Japan. It's like, okay, well, if you're concerned about oil, we can do one of two things. We can coordinate attack on Russia and take their oil and, split it both ways. Or, something that makes even more sense, option B, before Germany invades Russia, Germany and Japan can coordinate their attacks in Indonesia. They can coordinate their attacks in the Middle East and India and in that whole region, totally destroy Britain, totally cripple Britain, totally rob Britain of their oil from Indonesia. At that point, they'll eliminate the Western Front for Germany. It'll be good for Germany. And then, after they secure the oil there, Germany will have a steady oil supply from their ally Japan. After that, they can then coordinate their attack on the Soviet Union. Japan can get the oil from Britain, or Britain's oil in Indonesia, and then Germany gets Russia's oil in wherever Russia was getting their oil from. I mean, why did they not coordinate this? Of course, according to the official narrative, what they want you to believe is it's because they were all madmen. They were all just power-hungry madmen that just weren't thinking about the consequences of their madness. They weren't thinking about the fact that their madness was going to cost them the war. They weren't thinking about that at all. They were just thinking about conquering the entire world by themselves. As if anybody could actually do that. It's like, oh yeah, I'm Japan. No, I'm going to conquer the whole world by myself. I'm Germany. I'm going to conquer the whole world by myself. Yeah, they want you to believe that these people had these irrational thoughts, and that was the motive behind their actions. Now, what else doesn't make sense is the fact that actually Japan and Russia already had bad blood. A lot of people don't know this, but Japan and the Soviet Union had an undeclared war right before World War II. Here's a little screenshot of an article called The Forgotten Soviet-Japanese War of 1939. What else is very interesting about this, in the same year that Germany invaded the Soviet Union without Japan, Japan attacks the United States, and then Germany decides to back Japan, supposedly because of their alliance. So this alliance between Japan, Germany, and Italy drags them all into war together when Japan attacks the United States, but it doesn't drag them all into war together when Germany attacks the Soviet Union. Why? Because of this neutrality pact that was passed just a couple of months before? It doesn't make any sense, and you're going to see why it makes even less sense in a moment. So this is what the article says about number 7, about if Germany had coordinated with Japan on the invasion of the Soviet Union. So it says, Germany made a serious mistake by invading the Soviet Union on its own when it could have coordinated with Japan and forced the Soviet to fight on 2 fronts. One reason why the Soviet winter counteroffensive succeeded just a few kilometers from Moscow was that the Soviets were capable of reinforcing their military with well-equipped and well-trained divisions from Siberia. So this is what this article says. However, I found this bit of information from this other documentary. Check out what this documentary says about how the Japanese actually marched their military away from the Soviet Union, which was basically a sign to the Soviet Union of like, hey, don't worry, you don't have to worry about Japan attacking you from the east, go ahead and send all of your troops to your west, which would have been the front that Germany and Russia would have been fighting on. So check this out.
But because the Japanese had marched south, Stalin was able to bring back Marshal Zhukov's 40 Siberian divisions to Moscow. Zhukov made the difference. German losses that winter were around 400,000.
So I just want to quickly get the facts straight before I go to the next blunder on this list. This occurred when Hitler was just kilometers away from Moscow. When Hitler's army is just kilometers away from Moscow, Japan decides, hey, you know what? We're going to march our troops away from the Soviet Union, a sign to the Soviet Union that they don't have to worry about Japan, which will allow the Soviet Union to then rearrange its military forces and basically reinforce Moscow. So let's look at blunder number 6. If Hitler didn't interfere with battle strategy. Let's check this out. Hitler's interference with battle strategy caused more damage than the combined efforts of the Allied forces. So he bypassed his generals on the Eastern Front and assumed day-to-day operational command of the army. Worse yet, Hitler did not consider any point of view that differed from his own. He issued orders based on his perception of reality. From his headquarters in Germany, Hitler directed the movements of individual divisions on the Eastern Front using information that was too old by the time it reached him. For example, Hitler's directive that German troops should stand firm in Moscow was against the counsel of his military officers on the ground. It led to the deaths of 1 million German soldiers. So check this out. You got Hitler and Japan. Japan could have easily have told Hitler ahead of time, hey, we're going to be moving our soldiers south away from Russia, which might cause Russia to reinforce Moscow, so you might want to get your guys out of there. Instead of them coordinating that at all, Japan marches the troops south, you have the reinforcements arriving to Moscow, Hitler's generals and his own troops telling him, like, yo, we should kind of leave because it looks like something else is going on here. It looks like they're getting reinforcements. We should leave. Hitler's like, no, you guys got to stay there. And it caused the deaths of 1 million German soldiers. And people scratch their heads at this. Oh, no, we don't know why he did that. Or he did that because of his arrogance and all of the other things that I've already listed off. And this is what they teach us in school. And as, stupid little kids, we say, oh, yeah, that makes sense. It was his arrogance. No, it was calculated, strategic, and done completely out of malice. Moreover, several historians believe that it wasn't just the firepower of the Allied forces that made their invasion of Normandy successful. Hitler's refusal to listen to wise military counsel played a major role in the defeat of German forces in France. So Hitler's just intentionally losing the war on both fronts. Let's go to number 5. Hitler did not order the bombing of British cities. So if Hitler did not order the bombing of British cities, let's check this out. Germany's bombing campaign on Britain, initially restricted to military and industrial targets, was aimed at crippling Britain's capacity to defend itself. In fact, Germany made remarkable gains in the bombardment of military installations, especially British Air Force bases and airfields. When the Royal Air Force launched a retaliatory air raid on Berlin, Hitler lost his temper and ignored the significant progress that German Air Force had made against its British counterpart. In September of 1940, several British airfields and Air Force bases had been destroyed. The RAF, the Royal Air Force, was hopping on one leg when Hitler gave it a respite and ordered that German planes bombard British cities, especially London. This gave the Royal Air Force ample time to repair its airfields and bases and return to battle at full capacity. I find that to be pretty astonishing. It's like, oh yeah, you know what? Stop bombing those targets that actually matter and can actually pose a threat to our own air and our own military, and bomb those helpless civilians. Oh, why? Oh, well, because they bombed Berlin. That's going to be my excuse. That's going to be the historian's excuse that, oh, I did this out of rage and out of madness and, just out of stupidity. Oh, just such arrogance. And that's essentially what they give for all of these. So number 4, if Hitler did not halt the pursuit of British forces at Dunkirk. Now this one makes absolutely no frickin' sense whatsoever. So in May of 1940, German infantry units and several tank divisions were in pursuit of 350,000 British soldiers at Dunkirk. The Panzer Tank Division were on the verge of surrounding the British forces, while the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, conducted an unimpeded bombing raid on the enemy. Suddenly, just out of nowhere, Hitler gave the halt order. Hitler's like, oh no, fuck. There's how many British soldiers over there? 350,000? Shit, I can't capture all of those soldiers right now. It's too early. More people have to die. So suddenly, Hitler gave the halt order. Rather than let the fast-driving Panzer tanks overtake the British Expeditionary Force, the BEF, Hitler wanted the slow-moving infantry units to do the job. The British military command capitalized on Hitler's mistake and mobilized ships, yachts, fishing boats, rowboats, and lifeboats to evacuate the BEF. Eventually, only 40,000 British troops were captured by the Germans. If Hitler had allowed the Panzer Division to continue their pursuit, the Germans could have captured significantly more British troops. Britain may have surrendered early in the war, just like France. Now, what's incredible, of course, they don't give any, madman reasons for why he did that. There's absolutely no historical reason why he gave this halt order. The person can't say, oh, it's because he had a superiority complex, or, oh, because he did it out of a fit of rage. There's no reason for this halt order. And what's interesting is that this happened in May of 1940. Now remember, they didn't invade the Soviet Union until June of 1941. But what's also interesting about May of 1940 is that according to Wikipedia, in June of 1940, the British Army only had 1.65 million men. So if Hitler had managed to capture 350,000 British Army personnel in May of 1940, that would have been a huge chunk of the British military. There's many things that Hitler could have done to very easily win World War II. I believe he intentionally lost World War II. And I believe that they ran World War II in such a way to intentionally kill or to intentionally inflict as much damage on Europe and on the European population as possible. Now, the other thing, of course, the mentioning about international communism becoming strong enough in order to balance Christendom. Now, I believe that World War II strengthened international communism and balanced it with Christendom in a couple of ways. One is that it destroyed a lot of the Soviet Union satellite states, which actually allowed the Soviet Union to even take those states to begin with.
So World War II actually did strengthen communism in the fact that it made Russia bigger. That's one way that it strengthened communism. The other way that World War II balanced communism or international communism with Christendom is, like I said, was by killing a lot of these Christians. And not just killing a lot of Christians, especially the older Christians, but also by making people less religious afterwards. Like, a lot of people acknowledge that World War II, or at least actually both of the world wars, made a lot of people lose faith in God. So that's another thing that it did. Not only did it kill off the older, wiser, and more religious populations, and when I say religious, I mean mostly Protestant. So not only did it kill off these populations, but then it made the younger populations less religious. Okay, now moving away from there, one of the very last things that I would like to comment on is this documentary titled Adolf Hitler, The Greatest Story Never Told. I'd like to know why this documentary that totally glorifies Hitler fails to mention Hitler's ancestry, fails to really mention his working with the Zionists to build up Israel, fails to mention that he didn't behave anything like the Protestant he pretended he was, and fails to mention a number of other important things about Adolf Hitler, like him being trained to be a public speaker by what appears to be an obvious member of the club's cult. And of course, this documentary that attempts to glorify Hitler tries to rationalize his military blunders. It tries to make it like, oh yes, he had to attack the Soviet Union when he attacked the Soviet Union. To me, it's a complete work of propaganda. It is controlled opposition that is further trying to muddy the waters and divide the public on this topic.
I mean, hasn't that ever occurred to you, man?